It's 1982. You're at a stoplight in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Next to you sits a brand new Corvette, all gleaming paint and attitude, with a 400 cubic inch small block rumbling under the hood. The driver looks over at your beat-up '79 Camaro and smirks. Not a polite smile. A smirk. The kind that says, "Kid, just stay home." Light goes green. And somehow, impossibly, you absolutely destroy him. Not close. Annihilation. The Corvette driver is still sitting there, mouth open, watching your taillights disappear into the Oklahoma night. The secret behind that moment? $8. $8 and a parts mix-up that accidentally exposed one of the biggest engineering failures in American automotive history, and then caused General Motors to lose their minds trying to bury it. Here's the thing, this isn't just a story about a fast car. This is a story about corporate complacency, grassroots genius, and what happens when a small-town mechanic accidentally embarrasses one of the most powerful companies in the world. This is Legacy Engines, and I spend way too much time thinking about the mechanical secrets that Detroit tried to erase from history. If you're someone who loves deep-dive stories about forgotten automotive legends, suppressed performance tricks, and the real history behind the cars that shaped American culture, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Now, before we get to the $8 miracle, we need to talk about the engine at the center of this story. Because to truly appreciate what happened in a small garage in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, you need to understand just how deeply, profoundly, embarrassingly bad the Chevrolet 305 V8 actually was. Look, I don't use the word terrible lightly when talking about engines. Every engine has a purpose. Every design has context. But the 305? The 305 was GM's answer to the energy crisis and emissions regulations of the 1970s, and it was about as inspiring as watching paint dry in a church parking lot on a Tuesday afternoon in July. Introduced in 1976, the 305 was essentially a small-bore version of the beloved 350 cubic inch small block. GM took a perfectly good engine architecture, one that had powered muscle cars and racing legends for years, and they neutered it completely. The bore was shrunken down to just 3.736 inches. Combined with a 3.48-inch stroke, you got 305 cubic inches of displacement and a whole lot of disappointment wrapped in cast iron. The stock horsepower numbers were genuinely embarrassing. In 1976, the 305 produced 145 horsepower. By 1980, thanks to increasingly strict emissions controls that were being bolted onto these engines like technological ankle weights, some versions had dropped all the way down to 120 horsepower. Let that sink in. 120 horsepower from a 305 cubic inch V8. That works out to roughly 0.39 horsepower per cubic inch. Here's what most people don't realize. Modern lawnmowers, actual riding lawnmowers, achieve better specific power output than that. We're talking about a car engine that couldn't keep pace with yard equipment on a per cubic inch basis. But here's what made the 305 truly terrible, and this is important because it sets up everything that comes later. It wasn't just slow. It was inefficient at being slow. The compression ratio was a pathetic 8.6 to 1. The camshaft was so mild that the engine barely seemed to understand it was supposed to be a performance V8. The cylinder heads flowed air like you were trying to breathe through a coffee stirrer, one of those tiny ones they give you at airport kiosks. The intake manifold appeared to have been designed by someone who actively hated the concept of airflow. And the cast iron exhaust manifolds were so restrictive they looked less like performance components and more like mechanical punishment. GM installed these engines in everything. Camaros, Corvettes, Monte Carlos, Malibus, trucks. If you wanted a small block Chevy in your new car during this era, congratulations, you almost certainly got stuck with a 305. The automotive press was absolutely brutal in their assessments. Car and Driver described it as an engine that makes you wonder if Chevrolet has given up entirely. Motor Trend called it adequate for those who have appropriately lowered their expectations. Owners hated them. Mechanics hated working on them. Even GM engineers, privately and off the record, admitted the 305 was a compliance engine. It existed to satisfy government regulators, not customers. The fundamental problem was that the emissions technology of the era was primitive by any modern standard. Instead of actually cleaning up the combustion process, engineers in the mid-1970s essentially just strangled the engine. Air injection pumps, early catalytic converters, exhaust gas recirculation systems, restrictive air cleaners, lean carburetor calibrations. Each individual system added to reduce emissions also reduced power, and the cumulative effect was devastating. By 1980, a Camaro equipped with the 305 took over 11 seconds to reach 60 miles per hour from a standstill. A modern minivan, the kind with 3 rows of seats and a sliding door, would absolutely embarrass it off the line. The quarter mile came up in around 18 seconds at roughly 73 miles per hour. These weren't performance numbers. These were participation trophies measured in elapsed time. And this was the world that Jerry Patterson woke up to every single morning in his 2-bay garage in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. Jerry wasn't running some high-tech performance shop with dynos and computer equipment. This was a basic, honest repair garage where he changed oil, fixed brakes, and rebuilt carburetors for regular working people. He'd been wrenching since he was 15 years old, learned the trade from his father, and had developed that particular brand of mechanical intuition that simply cannot be taught in any classroom. The kind where you put your hand on an engine and you just know something isn't right. Jerry's specific frustration was this. Almost every other customer who rolled into his shop with a 305 had the exact same complaint. It's gutless. Can you make it faster? Do something. Anything. And Jerry would have to look them in the eye and explain that there wasn't much he could do within reason. The engine was fundamentally limited by design choices made in corporate boardrooms hundreds of miles away. You could add headers, maybe swap in a less restrictive exhaust system, perhaps install a better carburetor. But at the end of the day, as Jerry himself put it, you were essentially polishing a turd. By 1982, Jerry Patterson was genuinely frustrated in that deep, bone-level way that only mechanics who care about their craft can understand. He'd built proper hot rods in his younger days. He knew exactly what a healthy small-block Chevy could do when properly set up. Watching these 305s wheeze around Tulsa offended everything he believed about what an engine should be. There had to be a way to wake these things up without requiring customers to take out a second mortgage on their house. The warranty situation made everything worse. Customers would modify their 305s, void their GM warranties in the process, and then come back to blame Jerry when something unrelated broke 6 months later. Dealerships were conducting inspections, denying warranty claims the moment they spotted any unauthorized modification, and leaving owners stuck with repair bills they genuinely couldn't afford. Then came a Tuesday afternoon in April 1982 that changed everything. A customer had rolled in with a '79 Camaro, 305 under the hood, misfiring badly enough that it was barely drivable. Simple diagnosis. The distributor was worn out, contacts corroded, advance mechanism sticking. Jerry called his parts supplier, ordered a replacement, and went back to work on other jobs while he waited for delivery. When the box arrived, he pulled out the distributor, glanced at it, and immediately knew something was off. Instead of the correct unit for a 305, they'd sent him one spec'd for a 350. Clothes, physically almost identical, but not the same part. Jerry was about to pick up the phone and arrange a return when something stopped him. Just a thought, the kind that floats up from years of accumulated mechanical experience without any logical preamble. What if he just installed it anyway? The physical dimensions were identical. The bolt pattern matched perfectly. The cap and rotor would interchange without modification. Worst case, the engine would run poorly, he'd catch the issue on a test drive, swap it back out, and call the supplier while charging them for his wasted time. He dropped the 350 distributor into the Camaro's engine bay, bolted down the hold-down clamp, connected the vacuum advance line, and fired it up. The engine started immediately. But something was different from the moment it caught. The idle was smoother, steadier, more authoritative than any 305 Jerry had heard in years. When he blipped the throttle standing next to the car, the engine responded with a crispness that made him physically step back and look at it. He stood there for a moment in his shop, just listening. Then he got in and took it for a test drive through the streets of Broken Arrow. He nearly drove off the road. The Camaro pulled harder than any 305 he'd ever driven in his entire career. Not marginally harder. Not in a way you'd chalk up to a fresh tune-up or cleaner connections. Significantly, unmistakably, dramatically harder. The car accelerated with a confidence it had absolutely no right to possess based on anything Jerry knew about 305 engines. He drove back to the shop, parked it, and sat in the driver's seat for a long moment just thinking. He returned the car to the customer the next day without mentioning the parts mix-up, simply telling the owner he'd done a thorough tune while he was in there. The customer called the following afternoon absolutely raving. The car ran better than it had since he'd bought it. Better than it had ever run, actually. Jerry thanked him, hung up the phone, and immediately started pulling out every manual and parts catalog he owned. Here's what most people don't realize about doing mechanical research in 1982. You couldn't pull up a search engine. You couldn't watch a YouTube video. You couldn't post in a forum and have 12 experts answer your question within the hour. Jerry had to physically cross-reference Chilton and Haynes manuals, dig through parts catalogs, and make phone calls to distributor contacts who may or may not know what he was actually asking. It took him the better part of 2 weeks to piece together what he suspected. And what he found was genuinely fascinating. The 305 and the 350 shared almost identical external dimensions across a huge range of components. This wasn't accidental. GM had designed their small block family to be modular, sharing tooling and manufacturing processes across displacement variants to reduce production costs. Many parts crossed over between the two engines without any modification whatsoever. But here's where it got interesting, and this is where the story shifts from a parts mix-up into something much bigger. Every single 305 specific component had been calibrated specifically for emissions compliance. Not for performance. Not for efficiency. Not even for driver satisfaction. Purely for satisfying the EPA's requirements as written in the mid-1970s. The distributor advance curve was deliberately conservative, designed to prevent detonation when running on the low-quality, inconsistent octane fuel that was common in 1976. The vacuum advance was intentionally limited. The carburetor jetting was calibrated lean. The ignition timing was retarded from what the engine could actually handle. Every single calibration decision, from the factory, had been made with one goal in mind. Not blowing up an engine running on the worst possible fuel under the worst possible conditions, while satisfying regulatory inspectors checking boxes on a clipboard. The 350, being a larger displacement engine with slightly higher compression, had received marginally more aggressive calibrations from the factory. Not dramatically different, but different enough. And because these engines shared so many physical components and dimensions, those parts could be swapped between them freely. Jerry pulled a 305 from a junked Malibu sitting at a local salvage yard, paid almost nothing for it, and brought it back to his shop as a dedicated test mule. He was going to be systematic about this. First, he replicated the distributor swap on the test engine. Same result as the Camaro. The engine responded immediately, pulling harder, sounding stronger, revving more freely. He arranged time on a borrowed dynamometer at a local machine shop owned by a friend who owed him a favor. The numbers he got back stopped him cold. Stock 305, all factory-correct components properly installed and set to factory specifications. 123 horsepower measured at the wheels. Same engine, same day, only change being the 350 distributor installed in place of the 305 unit, 162 horsepower at the wheels. 39 additional horsepower from a junkyard part that cost him $8.15 of installation time. Not 39 horsepower from new heads. Not 39 horsepower from a stroker kit or a cam swap or an intake manifold upgrade. 39 horsepower from changing one component that looked nearly identical to the one it replaced. Jerry tested this on 5 more 305 engines pulled from various junked vehicles at the salvage yard. A Malibu, 2 more Camaros, a Bonneville, and a pickup truck. Every single one responded identically. Install the 350 distributor, set the timing correctly, and the engine transformed. Not incrementally. Dramatically. The results were consistent enough that Jerry began to understand this wasn't a fluke of one particular worn-out engine responding to fresh parts. This was fundamental. This was the 305 finally being allowed to breathe the way it always could have from the factory. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but why did it work? What was actually happening inside that distributor that made such a massive difference? This is where it gets really interesting, so stay with me because understanding the mechanics here is crucial to understanding why GM eventually lost their minds over this. The distributor in a late 1970s or early 1980s small block Chevrolet controlled ignition timing through 2 separate mechanisms working together. The first was mechanical advance, which used centrifugal weights mounted inside the distributor housing. As engine RPM increased, these weights would fly outward against spring tension, physically rotating the distributor shaft and advancing the timing. How quickly this happened, and how much total advance it provided, depended entirely on the stiffness of those springs and the physical stops that limited how far the weights could travel. The second mechanism was vacuum advance, using a diaphragm connected to manifold vacuum. Under light throttle and cruising conditions, high manifold vacuum would pull the diaphragm, rotating the breaker plate and advancing timing even further. This was primarily responsible for improving part throttle fuel efficiency and cruising economy. The 305 distributor used heavy advance springs that limited total mechanical advance to approximately 22 degrees by 4,000 revolutions per minute. The vacuum advance can provided only 8 additional degrees. With the factory base timing set at 8 degrees before top dead center, you were looking at a maximum of 38 degrees total timing under the best conditions. Conservative doesn't begin to describe it. The 350 distributor used lighter springs, allowing 30 degrees of mechanical advance by just 3,500 revolutions per minute. The vacuum advance can provided 12 degrees. Set the base at 10 degrees before top dead center, and you'd see 52 degrees total timing under light load cruising conditions. That's 14 degrees more than the 305 distributor was capable of providing. And here's why those 14 degrees mattered so profoundly. In practical combustion terms, timing advance determines when the flame front starts expanding inside the cylinder relative to where the piston is in its travel. Get it right and peak cylinder pressure coincides with the piston at the optimal geometric position to convert that pressure into rotational force at the crankshaft. Get it wrong, either too early or too late, and you're either fighting the piston's upward travel or generating heat and pressure after the piston has already passed its optimal position. The 305's 38 degrees was leaving an enormous amount of power on the table at every single RPM across the entire operating range. But here's the genuinely beautiful part of this, the part that makes the whole story even more ironic when you consider GM's reaction later. The 305's lower compression ratio of 8.6 to 1 actually made it more knock-resistant than the higher compression 350. The engine could physically tolerate more timing advance without detonating than the engine the distributor was originally designed for. GM had calibrated the 305's distributor for worst-case scenario conditions: cheap fuel, extreme heat, maximum load, high altitude. In real-world use, on a normal day, with the pump gasoline available by 1982, the 305 could safely handle dramatically more timing than the factory setup provided. Jerry had stumbled onto a situation where swapping in a part designed for a more aggressive engine actually worked better in the less aggressive one. The installation procedure itself was laughably simple. Pull the distributor cap. Mark where the rotor is pointing so you can maintain cylinder indexing. Remove the hold-down clamp bolt. Lift out the old distributor. Drop in the 350 unit with the rotor pointing the same direction as your mark. Reinstall the hold-down clamp. Connect the vacuum advance line. Set your base timing to 12 degrees before top dead center using a timing light. Total elapsed time for a competent mechanic: 15 minutes, maybe less if you'd done it before. The results across all of Jerry's test engines were strikingly consistent. Horsepower gains ranging from 35 to 45 horsepower depending on the specific engine's overall condition. Torque increases across the entire RPM band, not just at peak. 0 to 60 times dropping by 1.5 to 2 full seconds. Quarter-mile elapsed times improving by a complete second or more. And perhaps most surprisingly, fuel economy actually improving by 1 to 2 miles per gallon because the engine was now combusting fuel more completely and efficiently rather than sending unburned hydrocarbons out through the exhaust. These weren't marginal improvements you'd need a stopwatch to measure. These were transformations you felt the moment you put your foot down. A 305 with this modification could genuinely run with a stock 350. More importantly for what was about to happen next, nobody expected it. Show up to a stoplight or a street race in a base model Camaro with a 305, and everyone around you assumed you were free money. Then you took their confidence apart piece by piece from the moment the light went green. Word spread the way word always spreads in tight-knit mechanical communities. Slowly at first, then all at once. By fall of 1982, Jerry Patterson's little two-bay garage in Broken Arrow had quietly become legendary among Chevy owners across the greater Tulsa area. Street racers were making actual pilgrimages to his shop, driving hours to sit in his waiting room on folding chairs and drink bad coffee while Jerry worked. Regular folks who just wanted their Camaro to stop embarrassing them at stoplights were lining up weeks out for appointments. Jerry had accidentally created something he never intended to create. A phenomenon. Here's the thing about Jerry, though. He wasn't trying to protect this discovery like some closely guarded trade secret. That wasn't his personality, and it wasn't how he operated. He'd explain exactly what he was doing to anyone who sat across from him and asked a genuine question. He'd pull out the distributors, set them side by side on his workbench, and walk through the spring weights, the advance curves, the vacuum cans, all of it. He believed that knowledge belonged to the people who could use it, not to the person who happened to stumble onto it first. And because Jerry talked freely, people talked back. Customers would leave his shop and drive straight to their car club meetings and describe exactly what Jerry had done and exactly why it worked. Racers would pull up alongside their buddies at the strip and explain why their 305 suddenly ran like something twice its displacement. The modification started spreading through the grassroots automotive community the way the best ideas always do, organically, person to person, with genuine enthusiasm behind every conversation. A guy in Oklahoma City started doing it after hearing about Jerry through a mutual friend. Then a mechanic in Dallas picked it up after talking to someone from a Tulsa car club at a regional meet. Then Little Rock. Then Kansas City. Then Wichita. By early 1983, mechanics across a wide swath of the American Midwest were routinely installing 350 distributors into 305 engines. It had already acquired a name in the community. People were calling it the Patterson mod, though Jerry himself never asked for that recognition and reportedly found the whole thing mildly embarrassing. He was a mechanic, not a celebrity. He just wanted the 305 to stop being terrible. The street racing scene embraced it with the kind of wholehearted enthusiasm that only comes when something genuinely changes the competitive landscape. And it absolutely did. By mid-1983, if you showed up to an informal street race anywhere in Oklahoma or Texas in a 305-powered car, there was an immediate assumption in the crowd. Did it have the mod or not? The community had started making that distinction specifically, separating stock 305s from modified ones the way you'd separate different classes at an organized event. It became part of the pre-race conversation. Local drag strips started noticing something they couldn't immediately explain. Bracket racers running 305 engines were posting elapsed times that didn't match their supposed displacement. The cars looked stock. They sounded stock to a casual ear. They just ran faster than any 305 had any business running. Some tracks responded by requiring engine teardowns for cars posting suspiciously quick times. But here's the beautiful irony of that response. The modification left absolutely zero internal evidence. Pull the engine apart all you want. The pistons, the rods, the crankshaft, the camshaft, the heads, everything internal was factory stock. The only tell was that distributor, and smart racers learned very quickly to keep a stock unit in the trunk for exactly these situations. Now, you might be thinking, okay, this is a fun regional story about street racers in Oklahoma. Why does it matter beyond that? Here's what most people don't realize about what was happening during this period. The Patterson mod wasn't just making 305s faster. It was exposing something fundamental and deeply uncomfortable about the entire approach GM had taken to emissions compliance throughout the Malaise era. It was proving, with real-world data that any mechanic with a borrowed dyno could verify, that the 305's problems weren't inherent to its design. They were deliberately engineered in. The engine was capable of significantly better performance from the start. GM had simply chosen not to provide it. That realization had implications that went way beyond one distributor swap in one Oklahoma garage. It suggested that every compromise made in the name of emissions compliance during the 1970s deserved re-examination. It raised questions about whether the regulatory approach of the era, strangling engines rather than actually cleaning up combustion, had been as effective as advertised. And it raised a very uncomfortable question directly at GM's engineering department. If a backyard mechanic with $8.15 could unlock 35 to 40 horsepower from your engine, what exactly were your engineers doing for the decade before he showed up? High school and college kids particularly loved the modification for reasons that went beyond just performance. A 305-powered Camaro or Firebird was attainable transportation in the early 1980s. Used ones were everywhere and they were cheap because everyone knew the engine was weak. The Patterson mod changed the economics of that situation entirely. Buy the cheap, overlooked car with the maligned engine, spend $8.15, and suddenly you had something that wouldn't get laughed off the street. 4 teenagers running on summer job money, this was practically revolutionary. And GM dealerships had started noticing something strange happening with warranty claims. Not an increase in failure claims. An increase in modification discoveries during routine service. A customer would bring in their Camaro for a standard oil change. The technician would pop the hood, run through the standard inspection checklist, and there it would be. A 350 distributor sitting in a 305 engine bay, part number stamped clearly on the housing for anyone who knew what to look for. Warranty documentation would be flagged. The customer would be informed. An increasingly uncomfortable pattern was emerging in warranty administration reports flowing back toward Detroit. General Motors became formally aware of the Patterson mod in the spring of 1983. A warranty administrator working in Detroit noticed something that couldn't be attributed to coincidence. Multiple dealerships across Oklahoma, Texas, and Kansas were reporting the exact same finding in their service documentation. 305 engines with incorrect distributors installed. The geographic clustering was too tight and the pattern too consistent to be random parts errors or isolated mechanic mistake. Someone, or more accurately many someones, were doing this deliberately and systematically. GM dispatched field representatives to dealerships across the affected region to investigate. What they found when they got there was not what anyone in the corporate structure had hoped to find. Customers were absolutely and intentionally installing 350 distributors to increase performance. That part they'd expected. What they hadn't anticipated was the second part of what the field reps were reporting back. The modification worked. Definitively, measurably, undeniably worked. Several of the modified engines that dealers had flagged had been accumulating miles on the incorrect distributor for 20,000, 25,000, even 30,000 miles. No signs of mechanical stress. No detonation damage. No acceleratidguer. The engines were running well and the owners were happy, two things that weren't always true of stock 305s. GM's engineering team was formally asked to analyze the modification. They pulled several modified 305s from dealerships where owners had either surrendered them for inspection or where the vehicles had come in for other repairs. Those engines were taken to testing facilities and put on dynos. The results confirmed everything the street mechanics had already known for months. The modification consistently added 35 to 40 horsepower. The engines ran cooler under load than stock examples. They showed no signs of detonation on standard pump gasoline, where rates were normal. This is where it gets really interesting, and also where it gets deeply human in a way that explains everything about GM's subsequent response. The engineering team reviewing those dyno results was embarrassed. Not professionally embarrassed in some minor, easily dismissed way. Genuinely, profoundly embarrassed. A mechanic running a two-bay repair shop in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, with no engineering degree, no corporate resources, no sophisticated testing equipment, and no budget beyond $8 for a junkyard part had identified and solved a performance problem that GM's own engineers had either missed entirely or consciously ignored for the better part of a decade. The 305 could handle significantly more timing advance than GM had given it. The conservative calibration that perhaps made marginal sense for worst-case 1976 fuel conditions had become completely unnecessary overkill by 1983. Fuel quality had improved. The regulatory environment had evolved. And yet GM's engineers had continued shipping 305s with the same strangled timing curve year after year without revisiting whether those compromises were still justified. One man with a timing light and a borrowed dyno had done in 2 weeks what the entire engineering department had failed to do in 7 years. But here's where corporate psychology took over completely, and if you've ever watched a large institution respond to being embarrassed by an outsider, this next part will feel very familiar. Instead of acknowledging the error and using the discovery to improve future 305 calibrations, which would have been the rational and customer-focused response, GM decided that the modification was dangerous, unauthorized, and needed to be eliminated. They drafted a technical service bulletin and distributed it to dealerships across the country. The bulletin warned dealers about the practice of installing 350 distributors in 305 applications. It claimed the modification could cause engine damage. It suggested increased emissions. And in what has to be one of the more remarkable pieces of corporate reasoning ever committed to paper, it warned that increased performance might encourage reckless driving behavior. Let that sink in for a moment. General Motors, a company that had been voluntarily building high-performance engines and selling them in street cars for decades, was now officially arguing that making a car go faster was a safety hazard. The company that built the original Corvette, the company that created the legendary L88, the company that gave America the ZL1 Camaro, was warning customers that 162 horsepower was dangerously fast. The real issue was transparent to anyone paying attention. GM didn't want to admit they'd been selling underperforming engines that could be meaningfully improved for $8 in parts and 15 minutes of labor. The reputational math on that admission was simply too painful to contemplate. So instead, they went to war. Dealerships received explicit instructions to inspect every 305 that came through the service department. If a non-stock distributor was discovered, customers were to be formally notified that their warranty coverage was void and that the modification must be reversed at the customer's own expense before any warranty-covered work would be performed. Dealers who failed to report discovered modifications faced potential consequences regarding their franchise agreement. The crackdown moved fast. Customers who had the modification suddenly found themselves facing warranty denials for unrelated repairs. Some dealers enforced the policy aggressively, treating it as a serious violation. Others looked the other way, particularly in smaller communities where the dealer-customer relationship mattered more than a corporate directive from Detroit. Smart customers, and there were many of them, started keeping their original 305 distributors in a bag in their trunk. Before any service appointment, they'd spend 15 minutes swapping back to stock. After the appointment, 15 minutes back to the 350 unit. The modification was invisible if you weren't specifically looking for it, and half the dealers weren't specifically looking for it. GM also began sending cease and desist letters to mechanics who were publicly advertising the modification as a commercial service. Jerry Patterson received his in June of 1983. The letter was formal, corporate, and explicit in its threatened consequences. His attorney reviewed it and gave him straightforward advice. Stop doing it commercially. Jerry complied with the letter of that instruction. He stopped performing the modification as a billable service for customers. But here's the thing about information that's already spread across an entire regional automotive community. You cannot unspread it. Jerry didn't need to do the modification anymore. Half the mechanics in Northeast Oklahoma already knew exactly how to do it themselves. Then the automotive press got involved, and everything GM had been trying to manage quietly became very loud indeed. CarCraft ran a feature that asked pointed questions about why GM was targeting a modification that their own testing had shown to be both effective and harmless. Hot Rod magazine covered it under a headline that would have made the PR department in Detroit physically wince. The coverage framed it exactly the way it deserved to be framed. A small-town mechanic had found something real, GM had confirmed it worked, and then GM had responded by trying to suppress it rather than learn from it. The publicity did the opposite of what GM intended. It didn't discourage people from doing the modification. It made the modification aspirational. Doing something GM had explicitly banned, something their own engineers had confirmed worked, something that made your Malaise-era Camaro run the way it should have run from the factory, that felt like a genuine act of automotive rebellion. And in 1983, with muscle cars of fading memory and performance seemingly dead, American car enthusiasts were hungry for exactly that kind of rebellion. Let's get into the thermodynamics of why this worked at a deeper level, because understanding the actual science here reveals something important not just about the Patterson mod, but about the entire philosophy of engine calibration during the Malaise era and why it failed American drivers so completely. Internal combustion engines generate mechanical power through a deceptively simple process. Fuel and air mix inside a cylinder, ignition occurs, the resulting rapid expansion of combustion gases pushes a piston downward, and that linear motion gets converted into rotational force at the crankshaft. Every major variable in that process, the fuel mixture, the compression ratio, the valve timing, the ignition timing, affects how efficiently chemical energy gets converted into useful mechanical work. Change any one of those variables and you change the character of the engine fundamentally. Change the right one by the right amount and the results can be dramatic. Ignition timing is arguably the single most powerful calibration lever available to an engine tuner working within fixed hardware constraints. The reason comes down to basic physics. When the spark plug fires and the flame front begins expanding outward through the compressed fuel-air mixture, that process takes a finite amount of time. The piston is moving simultaneously. The goal is to have peak cylinder pressure, the moment of maximum force available to push the piston, coincide with the piston being at the geometric position where it can most efficiently convert that pressure into crankshaft rotation. That position is typically around 15 to 20 degrees after top dead center depending on the specific engine design. Here's the thing. If you fire the spark too late, combustion is still expanding when the piston has already traveled well past its optimal position. You're generating enormous heat and pressure, but much of it is pushing against a piston that's geometrically disadvantaged. Power output drops. Exhaust temperatures rise. The engine runs hot and inefficient. Alternatively, fire the spark too early and peak pressure arrives while the piston is still moving upward, fighting against the expanding combustion event. You get detonation, that characteristic sharp knocking sound that destroys pistons, damages rod bearings, and eventually grenades engines in spectacular fashion. The optimal timing advance sits in a precise window between those two failure modes. Too conservative, and you leave power on the table while the engine runs hot. Too aggressive, and you risk detonation damage. Finding that window accurately, across the entire RPM range and under varying load conditions, is what separates a well-calibrated engine from a poorly calibrated one. And the 305's factory calibration was nowhere near that window. GM's engineers had designed the 305 distributor advance curve around a specific set of worst-case assumptions. They assumed the lowest quality fuel available at any pump anywhere in America. They assumed maximum ambient temperature. They assumed maximum engine load. They assumed high-altitude operation where thinner air changes combustion dynamic. They built a timing curve that would prevent detonation under all of those conditions simultaneously, and the result was an engine that ran dramatically less timing than it could safely handle under normal, everyday driving conditions. This is where it gets really interesting from an engineering perspective. The 305's lower compression ratio of 8.6 to 1 actually created a thermodynamic irony that completely undermined GM's conservative approach. Lower compression means lower peak cylinder pressures during the compression stroke. Lower peak pressures mean the fuel-air mixture is less prone to pre-ignition and detonation. The 305 was physically more knock-resistant than the 350 it shared so many parts with, yet it was receiving dramatically more conservative timing calibration than the 350. GM had essentially given their most detonation-tolerant engine their most detonation-fearful timing curve. The engine that could safely run the most timing was receiving the least. Jerry Patterson hadn't known any of this when he installed that first 350 distributor by accident. He'd arrived at the same conclusion through empirical observation, through the mechanics method of try it and see what happens. But the thermodynamic explanation validated everything he'd discovered in his shop. The 305 with the 350 distributor installed was finally running timing close to its actual capability. Not beyond it. Not dangerously close to detonation. Just no longer unnecessarily, wastefully far below it. The improvement in fuel economy that accompanied the power gains deserves specific attention because it contradicts the intuitive assumption that making an engine more powerful must make it less efficient. The opposite was true in this case, and understanding why reveals another dimension of how badly calibrated the stock 305 was. When combustion timing is excessively retarded, the flame front is still expanding and burning fuel as the exhaust valve opens at the end of the power stroke. Partially burned fuel exits through the exhaust rather than completing combustion and contributing to piston movement. You're consuming fuel without extracting its full energy content, which is the definition of inefficiency. With more appropriate timing advance, combustion completes more fully during the power stroke. More of the fuel's chemical energy converts to mechanical work. Less exits as unburned hydrocarbons in the exhaust. The engine makes more power from the same amount of fuel, which means it needs less throttle to maintain any given speed, which means better fuel economy in real-world driving. The 1 to 2 miles per gallon improvement that Jerry's customers consistently reported wasn't a coincidence or a placebo effect. It was straightforward combustion physics expressing itself through the fuel gauge. Here's what most people don't realize about the emissions implications of all this. GM's official position in their technical service bulletin was that the modification increased emissions and was therefore environmentally irresponsible in addition to being mechanically dangerous. Their own testing, which they conducted and documented, showed the opposite. The modified 305s produced fewer hydrocarbons in exhaust testing than stock examples. They produced less carbon monoxide. The actual measured emissions of the modified engines were better than the engines GM had designed specifically to meet emissions standard. This finding was so awkward for GM's official narrative that it apparently never made it into any public communication from the company. If you're trying to argue that a modification is dangerous and environmentally harmful, discovering that it actually cleans up emissions rather than worsening them is not a finding you publicize. But the data existed. Mechanics who understood what they were looking at could see it in exhaust gas analyzer readings. The Patterson mod made 305s faster, more efficient, and cleaner simultaneously. It was, by any objective measure, a strict improvement over the factory calibration. The mechanical advance curve differences between the two distributors are worth examining in specific detail because they illustrate exactly where GM's conservatism cost the most power. At idle and very low RPM, the difference between the two distributors was relatively small. A few degrees of timing advance. The power difference at idle was noticeable in smoothness and throttle response, but not dramatic in absolute terms. As RPM climbed through the 1,500 to 2,500 range, the gap widened significantly. This is the RPM range that matters most for everyday driving, the range where normal acceleration, highway merging, and passing maneuvers occur. The 350 distributor's lighter advance springs allowed mechanical advance to build much more rapidly through this range. A driver using a modified 305 felt the difference immediately and continuously in normal driving, not just at wide-open throttle. Above 3,000 revolutions per minute, both distributors were approaching their full mechanical advance. The gap narrowed somewhat in absolute terms, but the vacuum advance differential kept the modified engine ahead through the mid-range. And at wide-open throttle, where vacuum advance drops out of the equation because manifold vacuum collapses under full load, the mechanical advance advantage still provided meaningful additional timing during the critical acceleration phase. Look, there's a reason performance tuners and engine builders have always considered timing advance the cheapest horsepower available. You're not adding hardware. You're not changing displacement. You're not improving airflow. You're simply ensuring that the combustion events already happening inside the engine are happening at the right moment to do maximum useful work. The Patterson mod was the purest possible expression of that principle, extracting maximum performance from existing hardware through calibration alone. GM's engineers, when confronted with the test data from modified 305s, reportedly acknowledged internally that the 305's factory timing curve had been more conservative than strictly necessary, even accounting for fuel quality variations. The problem was that acknowledging this publicly would have required admitting that customers had been sold underperforming engines for 7 years when better calibration had been available all along. The institutional cost of that admission was apparently higher than the cost of trying to suppress the modification and hoping it would go away. It would not go away. By mid-1983, the cease and desist letters had gone out. The technical service bulletins had been distributed. The warranty crackdown was in full effect, and the modification was more widely known and more widely practiced than it had been before GM's intervention. The Streisand effect, the phenomenon where trying to suppress information causes it to spread faster than it otherwise would have, was operating in full force years before anyone had a name for it. Every dealer who voided a warranty over a distributor swap created an angry customer who told the story to everyone he knew. Every cease and desist letter sent to a mechanic created a conversation about why GM was so threatened by an $8 improvement. The automotive press coverage that followed GM's crackdown had a quality to it that straight performance journalism rarely achieved. There was genuine outrage behind the reporting, not manufactured controversy but real anger from writers who understood what the numbers meant. When you can demonstrate with a dynamometer that a simple parts swap adds 40 horsepower to an engine the manufacturer had been selling as incapable of producing it, and then watch the manufacturer respond by threatening legal action against the people sharing that information, the story writes itself. CarCraft's coverage asked the question that every reader was already thinking. If the modification is dangerous, why do GM's own tests show the engines running better and cleaner with it installed? Hot Rod magazine went further, providing detailed technical instructions for performing the modification yourself at home, effectively distributing the information to their entire national readership in a single issue. The article noted dryly that the only tools required were a timing light, a wrench, and the willingness to improve your car beyond what the manufacturer intended. Subscription numbers for that particular issue were reportedly strong. Jerry Patterson read the coverage from his shop in Broken Arrow with complicated feelings. He was glad the information was out there. He genuinely believed that knowledge about how engines worked belonged to the people driving those engines, not to the corporations that manufactured them. But he was also a practical man with a mortgage and a business to protect, and the cease and desist letter sitting in his filing cabinet was a real thing with real legal consequences attached to it. He'd stopped performing the modification commercially. He hadn't stopped thinking about what it meant. What it meant, at its most fundamental level, was this. The relationship between manufacturers and the people who owned their products was more adversarial than most customers wanted to believe. GM hadn't miscalibrated the 305 by accident and then failed to notice for 7 years. They had made deliberate engineering compromises, decided those compromises were acceptable, and then defended those compromises aggressively when an outsider demonstrated they weren't necessary. The customer's experience of driving an underpowered car was, in GM's calculus, less important than avoiding regulatory complications and reputational embarrassment. Jerry Patterson had exposed that calculus with a junkyard part and a timing light, and no amount of technical service bulletins or legal threats was going to put that particular genie back in the bottle. The modification continued spreading. The conversations continued happening. And in garages across the American Midwest, mechanics kept dropping 350 distributors into 305 engine bays and watching the same transformation occur every single time. 35 to 40 horsepower just sitting there waiting, all along. The legacy of what Jerry Patterson accidentally started in that Broken Arrow garage in the spring of 1982 extends so far beyond one distributor swap in one Oklahoma engine bay that it's almost difficult to trace all the lines of influence outward from that single moment. But it's worth trying because understanding what the Patterson mod actually represented, not just as a performance trick but as an idea, tells you something important about innovation, institutions, and the eternal tension between the people who build things and the people who use them. Jerry retired in 1998. His shop in Broken Arrow closed quietly, no ceremony, no farewell event, just a mechanic who'd spent decades doing honest work deciding it was time to stop. The building got repurposed, the sign came down, and the physical evidence of where it all started disappeared into the ordinary turnover of commercial real estate. But the modification itself never stopped. Right now, today, there are 305 engines running around American roads and racetracks with 350 distributors installed in them. The part numbers have been memorized by an entire generation of Chevy enthusiasts. Used 350 distributors command a small but consistent premium at swap meets and online marketplaces specifically because knowledgeable buyers understand what they're actually purchasing. $30 for a distributor that transforms an engine. The math hasn't changed since 1982. Car clubs still honor Jerry's contribution in the particular way that automotive communities honor their legends, through the transmission of specific, practical knowledge from experienced members to newcomers. A kid shows up to a Camaro club meeting with a tired 305 and an empty wallet, and within 20 minutes someone older is explaining exactly what to buy and exactly how to install it. That's how mechanical tradition actually works. Not through formal documentation or institutional preservation, but through conversation between people who care about the same things. Here's what most people don't realize when they look back at the Patterson mod from the distance of 4 decades. The story isn't really about distributors. It's about the difference between optimization and compliance. GM had built the 305 to comply with regulations. They had calibrated every component to satisfy the minimum requirements of the regulatory environment they were operating in. Compliance was the goal, and compliance was what they achieved. What they did not achieve, and did not particularly try to achieve, was optimization. The best possible performance within the constraints they were working under. Jerry Patterson, with no regulatory obligations and no corporate agenda, had optimized. And the gap between those two approaches turned out to be 35 to 40 horsepower and a story that people are still telling. This distinction matters enormously because it's not unique to GM in the 1970s. It's a pattern that repeats throughout the history of manufactured products whenever large institutions face external compliance requirements. The institution asks what's the minimum we need to do to satisfy the requirement and then does exactly that. The outsider asks what's the best we can do within these constraints and often discovers the answer is dramatically better than what the institution settled for. Compliance thinking and optimization thinking produce radically different results even when they're working within identical constraints. The aftermarket performance industry owes something real and specific to what happened in Broken Arrow in 1982. Not because the Patterson mod invented the concept of timing advance, engineers had understood ignition timing for decades, but because it demonstrated with undeniable real-world evidence that simple calibration changes could yield dramatic performance improvements, and that those improvements were accessible to ordinary people with ordinary tools and ordinary budgets. Every modern tuning shop that makes its living flashing ECUs and optimizing fuel and ignition maps is operating on the same fundamental insight that Jerry Patterson arrived at empirically. Calibration matters as much as hardware, sometimes more. The electronic engine management systems that replaced mechanical distributors through the 1980s and 1990s were, in a sense, the industry's belated acknowledgement of everything the Patterson mod had demonstrated. Modern engine control units monitor NOx sensors in real time, adjusting timing advance dynamically based on actual combustion conditions rather than worst-case assumptions. They optimize for the fuel actually in the tank, the temperature actually present, the altitude actually experienced. They do automatically and continuously what Jerry did manually with a timing light and a junkyard part. The technology is incomparably more sophisticated. The underlying principle is identical. Give the engine the timing it can actually handle rather than the timing you're afraid it might not handle. GM's own response to the Patterson mod, when viewed through the lens of what came afterward, looks even more short-sighted than it did at the time. Later 305 engines received progressively better calibrations as electronic engine management replaced mechanical distributors and as engineers were freed from the constraints of purely mechanical advance curve. By 1987, the fuel-injected 305 was producing 150 horsepower in stock trim, closer to what Jerry had been achieving with his modification 5 years earlier. By the early 1990s, the engine was making numbers that would have seemed impossible in 1980. Not because the fundamental architecture had changed dramatically, but because calibration had improved. Because someone had finally asked the optimization question rather than the compliance question. But that evolution came too late to rescue the 305's reputation. The damage done by years of genuinely terrible factory calibration had cemented the engine's identity in the public consciousness. The 305 was the gutless engine. The compliance engine. The engine you got when you couldn't afford the good one. That reputation followed the engine to its discontinuation and follows it still in the way people talk about Malaise-era Chevy. The later, better calibrated versions never got the credit they deserved because nobody was paying attention anymore. There's a lesson embedded in that arc that goes beyond automotive history. Reputation is established early and changed slowly. GM spent years building the 305's reputation as an underpowered disappointment, and no amount of subsequent improvement fully overcame that early impression. The cost of those years of compliance-focused, optimization-ignored calibration wasn't just measured in horsepower. It was measured in customer perception, brand loyalty, and the long-term cultural standing of an engine that, properly set up, was actually a decent piece of machinery. Now, you might be thinking that this is all ancient history. Mechanical distributors are museum pieces. Modern engines are managed by software sophisticated enough to optimize timing thousands of times per second. The specific problem Jerry Patterson solved in 1982 can't recur in anything built after the mid-1990s. And you'd be right about the specific problem. But the general pattern it represents absolutely recurs, in different forms, across every industry where large institutions face external constraints and choose compliance over optimization. Look at modern automotive ECU tuning. Manufacturers ship cars with conservative fuel and ignition calibrations, partially for emissions compliance, partially for warranty protection, partially out of the same worst-case scenario thinking that produced the 305's terrible timing curve. Aftermarket tuners reflash those ECUs and extract 15, 20, sometimes 30% more power from hardware that was already paid for. The cars are faster, often more fuel efficient, and frequently run cooler because combustion is more complete. The manufacturers respond by voiding warranties and threatening legal action against tuning shop. The information spreads anyway because it's true and because it works. The Patterson mod is happening right now in every performance forum and tuning shop in the world, just with laptops instead of timing light. What makes Jerry Patterson's specific story stick? What gives it the quality of genuine legend rather than just interesting automotive trivia is the human dimension underneath the technical one. Jerry wasn't trying to embarrass General Motors. He wasn't making a political statement about corporate complacency or regulatory overreach. He was a mechanic in Oklahoma who was frustrated that his customers' cars ran badly and who had the curiosity and the confidence to try something different when a parts mistake accidentally pointed him in the right direction. His motivation was the most honest one available. He just wanted the engine to be less terrible. The fact that his $8 solution worked better than GM's decade of engineering effort says something both damning about corporate complacency and genuinely inspiring about what individual curiosity and practical intelligence can accomplish without resources, without credentials, and without permission. Jerry Patterson didn't have a dynamometer of his own. He didn't have a team of engineers. He didn't have access to GM's internal testing data or calibration documentation. He had mechanical intuition, a borrowed dyno, and the willingness to follow an accidental discovery wherever it led. That willingness, that quality of intellectual honesty that says I don't know why this works but it clearly does so I'm going to figure it out, is what separates the mechanics who change things from the mechanics who simply maintain them. Jerry maintained cars for a living. But for one period in 1982, he changed something. He changed what people believed was possible from an engine that everyone had written off, and that change propagated outward through an entire community and kept propagating long after Jerry himself had moved on. The 305 never became a great engine. Let's be honest about that. Even with the Patterson mod, even with the better factory calibrations that came later, it remained a compromised design born of compromised circumstances. The bore was too small, the heads were too restrictive, the camshaft was too mild. There was a ceiling on what timing advance alone could accomplish, and that ceiling was well below what a properly built 350 or a healthy 383 stroker could achieve. The Patterson mod didn't make the 305 great. It made it honest. It made it perform at the level it was actually capable of rather than the artificially suppressed level GM had chosen to deliver. And sometimes that's enough. Sometimes making something honest is the most important improvement you can make. Giving it back the capability that was always there, always built in, just waiting for someone curious enough to look for it and brave enough to try the obvious thing everyone else had assumed wasn't possible. 40 years later, mechanics are still doing it. Still dropping 350 distributors into tired 305 engines in old Camaros and Malibus and pickup. Still watching the same transformation happen. Still experiencing that moment of the engine coming alive under their hands, running the way it should have run from the day it left the factory. That persistence, that continued practice of a modification that could be documented in a single paragraph, is the truest measure of what Jerry Patterson actually accomplished in that two-bay garage in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. He found the performance that was already there, and he made sure nobody could take the knowledge of it away.